Right. It's probably in part due to Jane Austen that I ever began researching the story of Rose de Freycinet, and that's despite that I'd never seen the striking illustration of Jane Austen sitting on an Australian beach that's on the JASA website. It was the incongruous mental image of an Austen-like figure, complete with Empire Line gown and bonnet, walking on the shores of Shark Bay in Western Australia in 1818, that inspired me to follow up Rose's story. But I'll get to that in a minute. Rose de Freycinet, as you may know, was the first woman to sail around the world and leave a written account of her journey. She was probably also the first French woman to leave an account of the settlement at Port Jackson. Her husband Louis, along with his brother Henri, had already visited Sydney Cove with Nicholas Baudin in 1802, and it was this rather controversial voyage that made him determined to come back. I first came across the story of Rose de Freycinet at the other side of the continent while I was driving up north from Geraldton to Shark Bay on a research trip for another project. I'd hardly seen another vehicle all day on a long straight road with the desert on one side and the Indian Ocean on the other. And so after a few hours, I thought I'd take a break from driving and have a walk on the beach. So I went down a little side road and parked my little white rental car in the blazing sun to walk down to the water. As I gazed up and down the empty coastline, almost identical in both directions, the immensity of the landscape made me feel daunted and lonely. I might have been Robinson Crusoe, or the only person left in the world. And somewhere on one of those instructive notice boards that the Parks and Wildlife people put up, I read that on the 16th of September 1818, a young French woman had landed on a similar beach a little further up the peninsula. After her husband's matelots had carried her ashore from a longboat stranded on the sandbanks, Rose and Louis sat on a sandstone outcrop and ate some oysters gathered from nearby. She later wrote to her mother, "Certainly all those that I have eaten in Paris, at table and at my ease, did not seem to me as good as these, as I sat sitting on a rock, my glass and my plate on the sand." And so I had this rather odd vision of a 23-year-old French girl from the left bank, looking exactly like a Jane Austen character in her gown and sunbonnet, walking along the same beach. And if the landscape seemed lonely and unearthly to me, I thought, how must it have seemed to her? Rose was a near contemporary of Austen, and her life in some ways parallels the plot of the novel Persuasion, which was published in 1817, the same year that Austen died, and the same year that Rose embarked on her sea journey. Louis de Freycinet, a young French naval officer of good family, returned from the Napoleonic Wars at age 35 to find himself a modest 19-year-old bride in Rose, who was the daughter of a widowed schoolteacher, gently raised but without fortune or connections. Then, a few years on, Rose, deeply in love and unable to bear the idea of a 3-year parting from her husband, dressed herself in men's clothes, smuggled herself on board his ship, and set off to accompany him on a scientific expedition to the southern oceans. And in fact, there's a further coincidence or parallel in the plot in Rose's story, both in fiction and in real life. Jane Austen's brother Francis, or Frank, participated in the same Caribbean campaign at Santo Domingo in early 1806, as did Louis de Freycinet's brother Henri, who was also a naval officer. Frank Austen, at 32, returning unhurt to Plymouth in command of the HMS Canopus, with 3 captured French ships as a prize, had married 19-year-old Mary Gibson from Ramsgate in July that year. Jane Austen, as you know, bestowed a similar trajectory on her fictional character Captain Frederick Wentworth in Persuasion. Previously a rejected suitor, Wentworth returned to England a naval hero and in possession of just enough fortune to wed. Henri de Freycinet, of whom I don't have a picture, was, to begin with, rather less fortunate. In December 1805, with several of his old shipmates from the Baudin expedition, he sailed for the Caribbean in command of two ships, the Phaeton and the Voltigeur. In March 1806, after a firefight with the British off Santo Domingo, Henri's right arm was smashed by a cannonball and amputated at the shoulder by the ship's surgeon. Next day, the two ships, having suffered heavy losses, were boarded and captured by the British frigate Pique, and Henri was imprisoned in Jamaica. Of the 11 French vessels that had left Brest 3 months before, only 4 of them returned. Henri, missing both an arm and his ship, arrived back in France in late 1806 after an exchange of prisoners. Commended for bravery, he was promoted to commander. But in November 1808, he was taken prisoner again during the British blockade of the Channel ports. Honourably acquitted by court-martial for this second loss of a ship, he experimented with a prosthetic arm constructed of tin, cardboard, leather and elastic. And his handwriting, now clumsily performed with his left hand, became almost illegible. And I can only tell you it was illegible before. After sailing from Rochefort for a few years, he in 1814 proposed to 19-year-old Clementine Bérard from a prominent naval family whose father was chief of the Rochefort port. Henri and Louis's parents were overjoyed at this second marriage. "I have 4 sons," Pierre Louis de Freycinet wrote delightedly to Clementine before the wedding. "I love them dearly, but I had no daughters. Fate has fulfilled my wish, and now I will keep praying until I have 4 daughters. I dare say this is very presumptuous and demanding of me, but now I have a taste for it." Henri would later rise to further glory, being promoted to Rear Admiral and receiving the hereditary title of Baron as a colonial governor. But let's return to Shark Bay, Rose's first landing in Australia. And here it might be appropriate for me too to pay my respects to the Darramurrugal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and to thank them for the opportunity to visit. Louis and Rose also met with some of the local people at Shark Bay, a hunting party of Malgana men, or sauvages, or wild people, as they called them in the day, very dark-skinned, entirely naked, and carrying long and threatening spears. What did they make of each other, I wonder, and who was more surprised? Rose herself was terrified, she wrote in her journal, which she was keeping for a young school friend. On our arrival, we saw on top of the sandhills that lined the coast several figures whom we took at first to be some of our men who had gone hunting. They threatened us and made signs to us to return to the ship. It was then that I remembered what you said to me in one of your letters in Toulon, that I would hide myself behind Louis's coattails at the first sight of them. In truth, I confess that I was afraid and would willingly have hidden myself. Later, when more of the crew had gone ashore and set up a campsite and a scientific observatory, the French visitors had another encounter. On their first afternoon, a sentry woke one of the officers from a siesta to say that a group of 9 men, carrying spears, had appeared on the sandhills behind them. Some of the men picked up their guns, but mutually agreed not to fire except as a last resort. Expecting to meet fierce warriors, instead they faced a group who looked just as worried as they were. This image was drawn by the ship's artist, Jacques Arago, and you could see that by this time some trading had begun. One of the officers in his French naval uniform is handing over a gift of a large white cotton handkerchief, which one of the local men, not wanting to come too close, is cautiously accepting on the end of his spear. Behind him is Arago himself, who always carried around a pair of castanets and some magic tricks to entertain the people he was making portraits of. And you can see that some of the indigenous men are dancing to his playing. A few days after this, Rose also went ashore again, this time to share Louis's tent while he supervised his scientific work. And here you can see the whole camp, drawn by the other ship's artist, Alphonse Pellion, as if viewed from a boat offshore. At the centre are some barefoot sailors carrying buckets of seawater to the alembics or stills that they were using to produce fresh water. You may know that Shark Bay has virtually no fresh water at all. While others are chopping wood and filling barrels, others are tending cooking pots on an open fire. To the left, in front of a canvas shelter, there is some washing hung out to dry, and in front of the larger tent, a dozen long-barreled muskets fitted with bayonets, all neatly stacked. To the far right is Louis's private tent with the white Bourbon flag flying on top. You remember this was after the Restoration. Louis stands outside at his work table wearing his blue naval jacket and gold epaulets, which must have been incredibly hot in this, while Rose sits reading a book to a small Mauritian boy near the entrance. In the foreground, some of the officers examine a small shark, while more barefoot sailors carry baskets of oysters from the rocks. And here's another version of the same scene, also drawn by Pellion for the official records, and if you're sharp-eyed, you'll notice a significant difference. Not only are the untidy clothesline and the more ragged and louche-looking seamen gone, but so is Rose de Freycinet and the small boy. This dry landscape looks the same today. Rose did not know the area as Shark Bay. The Frenchman who had studied William Dampier's maps did not have a distinct word for shark, and so translated it as Baie de Chiens Marins, or Bay of Sea Dogs. Rose was probably not the first European woman to land on the west of the continent. That might have been one of the Dutch women from the wreck of the Batavia. And she wasn't even the first woman to have circumnavigated the world at that date. That was probably Jeanne Barré on Bougainville's expedition of exploration in 1766. But Rose, more importantly, was the first to leave a vivid description of this. Probably the most extraordinary thing about her journey, however, was that officially she was not there. It was highly against French naval regulations to take a wife on a naval ship, and Louis was a very conscientious and loyal naval officer. But Rose had persuaded him to smuggle her on board, and even more extraordinarily, he'd agreed. Up until now, very little was known of Rose's background beyond the date and place of her birth. It was thought that her mother's name was probably Jeanne. I was able to get an old French friend to look at some village records and find out some more. This is an early 20th century picture postcard of the small village of Saint-Julien-de-Sault in the Yonne River Valley in Burgundy, where Rose Pinon was born on the 29th of September 1794. Now this was something of a mystery to me, as her family was living in Paris at the time. However, this was in the middle of the French Revolution, and so my theory is that they might have been hiding out there due to their royalist connections. Rose's father, Etienne Pinon's relatives were all clockmakers, jewellers, armourers and artists under the patronage of the Bourbon royal family. And at this date, anyone suspected of not being loyal to the revolution could be summarily executed. Jane Austen never wrote about the French Revolution, to my knowledge, but she was well aware of the cruelty of it. Again, as you probably know, her cousin and future sister-in-law, Eliza Hancock, had married the Comte de Feuillide, a French aristocrat who had been guillotined in 1794, causing the Comtesse to flee to England, where she later married Jane's brother Henry. The widow Eliza's description of her husband's execution is said to have given Austen an intense horror of the French Revolution that lasted all her life. Rose's mother, Jeanne Tauzin, pious and with a love of learning, was the daughter of a carriage maker. Carriages were very expensive in those days, so she was probably from quite a prosperous family, despite being in trade. She was widowed early and to earn a living established a boarding school for young ladies, a kind of finishing school where foreign students could learn French and French manners. So while Rose grew up in relative poverty, she also grew up with an excellent education, including an ability to read books in English. Madame Pinon, on her death in March 1822, left behind a library of some 400 books, including several dozen in English. These included Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Fielding's Tom Jones, the works of Alexander Pope and Oliver Goldsmith, and a history of England, as well as some collected translated essays from The Spectator. I was disappointed, however, to find no evidence of the newly translated Persuasion among them. Louis de Freycinet, in contrast, came from an established Protestant family with a large rural estate in the south. Here he is in his mid-20s, not long after his voyage with Nicolas Baudin in the years 1800 to 1803. You can see that while 15 years older than Rose, he still has quite a boyish look, with his important-looking gold lieutenant's epaulet and his uniform collar nearly enveloping his ears. Privately tutored at home, Louis and Henri grew up with a love of natural history and science. Louis also loved poetry and music and was an avid reader, all of which interests he shared with Rose. In preparation for the voyage, he assembled on his ship, the Uranie, a library of some 2,000 books. Many of these were scientific works and narratives of earlier voyages, but 200 were chosen from his own personal library, works of literature and history, including an account in English of the colony of Port Jackson. So, when Louis married 19-year-old Rose in June 1814, she was probably regarded as having made a very good match. At this date, the Montélimar branch of the Freycinet family was of the haute bourgeoisie rather than the aristocracy, in, quote, the twilight region between the nobility and the gentry, as one writer puts it. But this was probably what allowed them to survive successfully the revolution. Louis and his three brothers grew up at the Château de Freycinet, close to the village of Saulx-sur-Rhône and the town of Montélimar. Walled grounds and a tree-lined driveway set among orchards and forests led to a substantial stone country house with a steep tiled roof and a third level of attic rooms. And you can see it still stands today. Louis de Freycinet had gone to sea at age 14, fighting in 3 sea battles against the British before embarking at age 21 with the Baudin voyage. After meeting Matthew Flinders and making friends with Governor Philip Gidley King at Port Jackson on his first visit, he returned to France on active duty, but in 1805 he was invalided ashore, ill and exhausted, to work in Paris on the Baudin expedition's maps. At this date, Rose was still an 11-year-old schoolgirl, but sometime in the following few years, they met and became engaged. The couple were married in Montmartre a week after Napoleon was exiled to Elba. And so, a few years later, when Louis was finally awarded his much-desired scientific expedition, they simply didn't want to be parted. On Tuesday, 16th of September 1817, the night before the Uranie sailed from Toulon, Rose left her lodgings in the Rue Saint-Roch, where she had been living with Louis for several months before his departure. Her friends thought she was leaving to take the midnight coach for Marseille, where her father-in-law and she would return to the Château de Freycinet. Instead, she made her way alone to the house of a friend in a cluster of narrow streets near the harbour. At midnight, with her hair cut short and dressed as a boy, she rode out with Louis and one of his friends and secretly boarded the ship, and then she hid in Louis's cabin. Here she would live as the only woman among 120 men for 3 years. When the French government discovered what she'd done, there was a huge scandal in all the newspapers. And this is where I found another useful epigraph from Persuasion. The Admiral abused him for his want of gallantry. Wentworth defended himself, though professing that he would never willingly admit any ladies on board a ship of his except for a ball or a visit, which a few hours might comprehend. "But if I know myself," said he, "this is from no want of gallantry towards them. It's rather that feeling how impossible it is, with all one's efforts and all one's sacrifices, to make accommodations on board such as a woman ought to have." Early in his preparations for the voyage, Louis had surreptitiously fitted out his ship so that his wife might have a private space to live in. A dozen letters passed between himself and the Naval Ministry about his urgent need for an extra officer's cabin, among other improvements. In 1817, the maritime prefect in Toulon discovered that Freycinet wanted to add a dunette, or poop, the highest and hindmost structure on a ship's stern, roofed by a small additional deck. Astonished at such an expensive last-minute request, and worried that the extra weight high above the waterline might destabilise the vessel, the prefect was not inclined to approve it. Louis got his way, however, and the dunette was built behind quarterdeck. This allowed for several additional antechambers and a small stateroom to be added. The deck above also provided a private space where Rose might walk and take the air largely unobserved. Not least, the innovation allowed for extra bathing facilities. While it was the customary duty of cabin boys or other personal domestiques to carry hot water to the officers' quarters and to empty their chamber pots, only the captain had the dignity of a private latrine, usually built on a small balcony off the stern castle. For all the others, the communal toilet or head, a wooden platform in the bow close to the waterline with vents so that the waves could sluice through, had to suffice. Louis also had a tin bath brought on board. Rose would later mention the cooling baths that helped relieve her headaches in the tropics. Rose would also need a private place too, in which she might launder such intimate gardens as rags, the linen or cotton napkins she used to deal with menstruation. Our bedroom is right at the stern of the vessel, so that when the door opening into the dining room is shut, I am altogether isolated and extremely peaceful in this simple and comfortable little cell, Rose wrote reassuringly to her mother soon after the voyage began. Despite all this, what Rose was doing was extremely dangerous. Any ship of the day was pretty unhealthy. Hygiene and diet were poor. The Uranie itself was about a tennis court and a half in length, with cramped lower decks of mostly less than head height, where cholera, smallpox, and amoebic dysentery could spread quickly. Apart from the dangers of storm and shipwreck or attack by pirates, what would happen if Rose became pregnant during the voyage? But then on the other hand, for anyone who ever wanted to run away to sea, this was where the great adventure began. After visiting Gibraltar and Tenerife, the Uranie crossed the equator and called in at Rio de Janeiro. Rose wrote about the strange and exotic landscape she saw and the beautiful new flowers and birds. In Brazil, she also had her first confronting experiences of slavery and other strange customs. Then came Cape Town and Mauritius, or Ile de France, as the French still called it, and Ile Bourbon, or Réunion, in the Indian Ocean. This is how Rose made her social calls during a very long and interesting stay at Port Louis in Mauritius. After the long crossing to Shark Bay, which was their first stopover in a region as yet untouched by European colonial settlement, they sailed north to Kupang, a Dutch enclave in Timor, and then to Dili, the site of a small Portuguese settlement. When the Portuguese governor learned that Rose was on board, he organised a formal reception for her, which gave the artist Jacques Arago an opportunity for more fun. Rose, without the finery needed for such a grand occasion, wrote that she dressed herself as best she could, donning a muslin dress and decorating her bonnet with feathers. As 6 cannons roared out a salute from the fortress, she took Louis's arm and carefully descended the gangplank from the longboat in front of a very large crowd. On her stepping ashore, the governor guided her under the shade of a huge parasol carried by a Timorese slave. Both Alphonse Pellion and Jacques Arago created images of this scene. In Arago's version, we see Rose, her ostrich feathers feather plumes, nodding gracefully, stepping off the gangplank hand in hand with Louis to greet the governor. While behind them, if you look carefully, you'll see an officer in full uniform falling head over turkey back into the longboat, with his shiny boots pointing skyward. Unsurprisingly, this image was once again not included in the official record. In Pellion's official version, Louis, as a solitary, dignified figure formally attired in his blue tailcoat and hat, walks down the gangplank alone. Further north into the Pacific Ocean, among a myriad of tiny islands, in December 1818, Rose noted in her journal, "I sometimes remember that my mother wrote to me, when I was still in Toulon, that a map of Paris and its surrounds was enough for her to find each of the places we had lived in. And then afterwards we needed a map of France. And finally, only on a map of the world would she be able to follow us. Now, a very detailed map of Oceania, if there is one, would be needed to know where we are." Here in the Moluccas, or Papuan Islands, Rose lived among people reputed to be cannibals and pirates, and also among the charming and handsome people of the Mariana Islands. So here, where most male naval accounts of the day, you would normally see a picture of bare-breasted islander women dancing, I've included this one, also by Arago, especially for the women among us, which I think is rather decorative. After a long sojourn in Guam to allow the crew to convalesce from scurvy and malaria, came a long visit to Hawaii. Then the Urani headed south again and re-entered the southern hemisphere. In October 1819, in eastern Samoa, Rose wrote to Madame Pinon that they had discovered an isolated atoll not marked in the maps. Rose wrote that she was pleased and proud that Louis had named it Ile Rose. Louis himself noted rather enigmatically that he'd named it for, quote, "someone extremely dear to me." This was the only allusion to her presence in his entire and very voluminous account of the expedition. Finally, after another long sea passage, they sighted the lighthouse on the Heads at the entrance to Sydney Harbour. On the evening of Thursday, 18 November, in the darkness, the Urani anchored in Neutral Bay, directly opposite Sydney Cove. Rose was eagerly awaiting to collect letters from France, the first they'd had in more than 2 years. Next morning, when she rose at daybreak and went out on the deck, she found herself in full view of the English settlement across the water. Imagine then my astonishment this morning to find myself quite close to a town, and a town with houses in it, built in the European style. It is 18 months since I saw anything of the kind, and it was a very great pleasure to me, she wrote to her mother. Wishing to enjoy her surprise, that wretch of a Louis hadn't told her what to expect, she noted. So here is Port Jackson, as Rose might have seen it from Observatory Hill. Captain John Piper, the harbour master, whom Louis knew from his previous visit with Baudin, came on board early and brought them, along with some of their mail, some fresh eggs, some fresh fruit, and some milk for their breakfast, knowing they hadn't seen any for many months. But after this promising start, things didn't go quite so well. Louis rented a house near Lower Fort Street in the Rocks, and a few days later Rose went ashore for the first time and moved in. The Rocks, conveniently close to the waterfront and to Dawes Point Observatory for Louis, was already less than a salubrious area, with its narrow footways and crowded dwellings. That first night, while they slept upstairs, a convict crept into the ground floor and stole all their crested silverware and a large quantity of clothing and linen. This is the notice from the Sydney Gazette, dated Saturday, 24 November 1819, listing the stolen items and the generous reward for their return. "It would be as surprising not to find thieves here as it would be not to meet Parisians in Paris or the English in London," wrote Rose philosophically in her journal. And here I'm going to go down a rather different Austen rabbit hole, if you have the patience, although this had to be cut out of the book for reasons of length. I imagine you've heard the story of Jane's allegedly shoplifting aunt, Janet Lee Parrott, whom Suzanne Falkiner has written about, among others. In August 1799, Mrs. Lee Parrott was tried for stealing a card of lace worth 20 shillings from a Bath haberdashery. Mrs. Lee Parrott in turn accused the shopkeeper of an extortion attempt aimed at her prominent family by planting the merchandise in her parcel. She was found not guilty, although later events suggested that she may have been a kleptomaniac. Another little-known story is that while in Sydney in 1803, Nicholas Baudin acquired a convict girlfriend, Mary Beckworth, also a shoplifter, who'd gone on trial in England for a similar crime. Mary Beckworth and her mother, or possibly her stepmother, who was also called Mary Beckworth, had landed with the convict ship Nile 6 months before. The senior Beckworth, aged 35 and of respectable appearance, had been selected by the Judge Advocate Richard Atkins, whose wife was absent, as his housekeeper. Young Mary, now listed as age 17, 5 feet tall, with brown hair and hazel eyes, remained with her. When young Mary met Baudin in Atkins' household, she told them that when her mother was transported for shoplifting, she, in preference to being sent to a convent and to avoid embarrassing her respectable family, had volunteered to accompany her. Contrary to what she told Baudin, however, Mary too had been arrested for shoplifting. On 10th of June 1800, at age 14, she and her mother had stolen 46 yards of printed calico worth £5 from a Charing Cross scrapers by hiding it under her skirt. I'm still not entirely sure how you get that much. Anyway, no doubt their plausible manners were a useful attribute. While the theft of an article valued 5 shillings or more was punishable by death, female offenders were more commonly deported to Australia. The two Beckworths were sentenced to hanging, but later commuted to transportation for life. A year in Newgate prison and 6 months on a convict transport no doubt extended Mary's education in the ways of the world. Whatever her true situation at this date, some of the French company claimed to recognise young Mary as the fille de joie, or prostitute, that Baudin had cohabited with while on shore. In October 1802, while preparing to depart, Baudin asked Governor King if he might take Mary with him. While this was against regulations for deportees to the colony for less than a year, King responded diplomatically that if Mary wished to go, he undertook to make no inquiries about her. Mary's decision at 17 to seek protection from a man who was more than 30 years older than her, who spoke little English, and who was of decidedly ungracious manner, was probably entirely pragmatic. If the ship's artist Martin Petty's portrait is accurate, Baudin also had a fleshy receding chin and a prominent nose with a sizable wart on the tip of it. Shoplifting by women was evidently not all that uncommon in the period, and while Jane Austen's aunt, Jane Lee Parrott, was not sent to the colonies, probably because of her superior family connections, one wonders what might have befallen her if she had been. For Rose, however, the rest of the sojourn in Sydney was pleasant, with parties and balls and new friendships to make, and while her husband had other business to attend to. Louis had several objects in mind when he went ashore on the 19th of November to meet Governor Macquarie, such as reprovisioning and repairing his ship. However, he also had diplomatic aspects to consider. On his last arrival with Baudin, neither the English nor the French in Sydney knew whether their countries were still at war against each other. Governor King had treated them kindly, but France and England had been at war again in the interim. With the conflict finally ended at Waterloo 5 years earlier, the British at Port Jackson could afford to be gracious. But traditional rivalries persisted, and some of the British government were convinced that France still had territorial ambitions in the area. Louis, in turn, had been instructed by the French Naval Ministry to tread carefully. His men should maintain a low profile, he was told, and endeavour to attract the goodwill of military and civil officers, and not to disturb the understanding of the two countries. To the artist Jacques Arago, relations between the French and the English were marked by extreme politeness on both sides. Captain Piper, in particular, had welcomed them in a most flattering manner. "Shall we find everyone here equally obliging?" he wondered. But the French officers soon had a full social calendar. "We have engagements for a fortnight," wrote Arago to a friend, "and will you not be astonished that I, who have spoken occasionally with little favour of the English, should now be receiving their civilities and attentions? Today," he confided, "the word Englishman was never painful to his ear." Sydney was equally pleased with its interesting visitors, according to the Sydney Gazette, which described the French officers as gentlemen of the most kind and polished manners. Far from snubbing them, the colony's authorities were so attentive, wrote Rose, that they were forced to decline invitations so that Louis could attend to his scientific work. In this French picture of Government House at Parramatta, you can see on the left several figures who probably represent Rose and Louis arriving for a country visit. All the important people in the colony entertained them, Rose recorded, including Governor Macquarie and his wife Elizabeth, who spoke French, Barrenfield and his wife, who became her best friend, and John MacArthur and his family. And with all the balls and parties in their honour, there was almost a competition, I think. Rose decided that this was her favourite stopover of the entire journey. The Uranie left Sydney on Christmas Day 1819, inadvertently taking with them 10 convict stowaways who had hidden themselves on board, including a couple of French and some Irish, a German, and a black boy from Martinique who was probably an escaped slave. From Sydney, they expected to have a quick and triumphant passage home to France, carrying with them a wealth of natural history specimens and scientific records. After rounding Cape Horn, however, the ship was damaged in a storm in the South Atlantic, and so they headed for the Falkland Islands, which were then uninhabited, to make repairs. In February 1820, while entering the Berkeley Sound, the Uranie hit a submerged rock pinnacle and hauled its hull. At the end of the bay, they managed to beach the ship in shallow water, where over the next weeks the waves gradually broke it up. Rose's account of the events over the next months is quite harrowing, although she hid this in her later letters home. Here's Jacques Arago's drawing of the shipwreck, where you can see the survivors' shore camp, French Bay in the Falklands. The sandy beach is littered with bundles and ropes and smaller boats that they've rescued, while the Uranie's fallen masts and rigging are caught in the shallows. Tents made from sailcloth and spars dot the dunes under a wintry grey sky, and a sailor climbs a sandhill behind them to shoot at the wheeling seabirds for food. Here's the same scene from a different angle, as drawn by Alphonse Pellion, when the camp was a little more established. On the far left, offshore, is the shipwrecked Uranie, and further to the right, a white distress signal is flying. The company would spend 2 cold and arduous months in these tents. Louis became seriously ill, and Rose, while nursing him, worried what might happen if he should die and the crew mutinied, which sometimes did happen after shipwrecks. You might remember the story of the Batavia. However, they were finally rescued and arrived back in France in an American vessel. I should add that this bay, sheltered bay, was often visited by whalers who were putting in to try and collect supplies or repair their ships. They finally arrived back in France, and where Louis was court-martialed for losing his ship. Rose died on 7th of May 1832, some 10 years after their return, at age 36. After nursing Louis through the cholera epidemic in Paris in 1832, a few days later she caught the disease herself and died of it. 7 years later, after Louis's own death, her remains were removed from Paris to join his in the family cemetery at the Château de Freycinet. This picture of Rose's grave was taken by Meredith Lawn, an archivist at the State Library, who became so intrigued by the Freycinet records that she was cataloguing that she visited the chateau herself while on holiday in Europe. And she helped me very greatly with my research, I might add, letting me see documents before they'd been catalogued. Louis died at Saulce-sur-Rhône on 18th August 1842, still grief-stricken at losing Rose, and after spending most of the rest of his life writing his official account of the voyage. As I've mentioned, there's no direct mention of Rose in this account. No officer on board, not even Louis, wrote of her presence in their journals. Officially, she was simply not there. However, along with the ship's chaplain, there was another civilian on board who was not bound by naval regulations, and this was Jacques Arago, who kept his own journal. Arago was an intriguing character. While Rose was dancing at colonial balls and dining with governors, he was visiting the local brothels and slave markets and getting to know the local indigenous people. Arago wrote several accounts of the voyage, but he didn't publish anything about Rose until after Louis's death. My main source for the book, of course, was Rose's own journal, along with her letters home to her mother, Madame Pinon. The handwritten account, delivered to her friend Caroline de Nantouillet on her return to France in 1820, remained with the Nantouillet family for over 90 years, and then was given back to the Freycinet family in 1913. The journal was published in an abridged version in Paris in around 1927, and again translated into English by Marc-Serge Rivière in 1996. By coincidence, it was a member of the Jane Austen Society, Jenny Evans, or the author Jennifer Painter, who has also cleverly reimagined another Austen character, the forgotten sister Mary Bennet in Australia, who first gave me a copy of Rivière's translation. I found this English version rather bland at first, but then I discovered that by this time it had passed through the hands of several male editors who, for various reasons, had bowdlerized it, and this was to avoid passages considered overly personal or indelicate, or likely to diminish the Freycinet family's reputation, or that might reflect badly on public figures. Some of these alterations seem rather absurd today. For example, Rose's reflections on the undesirability of being sold into a seraglio by pirates, and even the mention of the devil in a crossing the lines ceremony, were censored. Other deletions concerned Louis's illness and religion. Also omitted is Rose's mention in Brazil of cinnamon flowers smelling like excrement, as is a reference to the smell of cooked meat at an overcrowded dinner in Mauritius, almost making her vomit. Also left out is the forthright comment from the shipwreck period, where Rose notes that the sailors disliked plain soup or bouillon with no flour to thicken it because, quote, it cleans out their bowels but it doesn't nourish them. This meant that I often had to go back to the original handwritten sources, and as you can see, Rose's journal, while very neat, is very difficult to read. So generally, as early maritime history is generally seen from a male point of view, from naval officers with weighty observations about wind direction and compass points, which of course are very important, it made me curious to see how such a story might look if written by a young girl. But at any rate, I'll stop here in case any of you have any questions.
It's fascinating. Does anyone have questions to ask? Kenny?
Just a few sentences first. Rose disguised herself to get on board her husband's ship and succeeded. Flinders' wife sneaked on board, but was discovered. Flinders' wife sneaked on board was discovered before they sailed from England and sent back to shore. And I believe he was away 9 years without seeing her. And of course, Cook left his wife at home when he voyaged. Now, how interesting that Rose was able to stay on board. Obviously, the French people on board were very discreet, but you mentioned that that there was an uproar in France about her being on board, but I'm not sure when that happened. And then just to link it with Mrs. Croft and Admiral Croft in Persuasion, she was allowed to stay on board. So it's just very interesting, these different abilities to state. 3 of them, of course, are English and 1 is French. So I just wonder if you've got sort of further ideas about, if you like, how she got away with it.
Well, everyone, of course, wonders whether Rose and Louis had heard the story of Matthew Flinders. Louis had met Matthew Flinders and liked him, and they had quite a lot of... So it's quite possible that Louis did know this story, so he planned it very carefully. He took her on board at midnight, dressed as a boy, and a friend with him. When the officers said, who's this boy? They said, oh, he's my son, he's just visiting. So they then sneaked her into the cabin, and she stayed there for 3 days until they were outside territorial waters, French territorial waters, so she couldn't be taken off. And of course, the next time they reached French territory, which was Réunion, it was a couple of months later, and the governor, who by that stage received letters from France, because the kerfuffle happened a couple of weeks after they'd left, when it was discovered that Rose had apparently disappeared on her way back to the Chateau de Freycinet. So the time lapse worked in their favour. But Rose so charmed the governor of Réunion that he decided, oh, look, so much time's passed, what's the point of taking her off now? And besides which, he would have had to look after her. So he just let her go. And of course, everybody was so intrigued that everybody wanted to entertain her.
How did Rose's journal end up with the New South Wales State Library?
That's a very good question. The state libraries had a lot of interest in the Baudin and the Freycinet expeditions, and they just kept accumulating more and more things. So there's an absolutely wonderful and extensive collection of almost every Freycinet document that's come up to public auction. The archive, which was kept at the Chateau de Freycinet for a long time, a descendant, one of the future Baron Freycinets, decided to sell it when the chateau was sold, I think. So it all started appearing in libraries all over the world.
Thanks so much. It's such an interesting story. So she never did become pregnant. Is there any evidence that miscarried or had any pregnancy?
She hadn't become pregnant in the 3 years of marriage before they left on the voyage. She didn't become pregnant during the voyage, and she didn't become pregnant in the rest of her life, but she had various illnesses. I talked to a doctor about this sort of thing, and my guess is that she might have had endometriosis or something like that, but it was heartbreaking for both of them that they never had children. But on the other hand, had she become pregnant after her marriage, it would have been impossible for her to stay with Louis.
I just wondered if your book is going to be translated into French.
I had a couple of people suggesting that, but it would be fairly complicated because I've translated and with the help of a translator transcribed and translated various letters. So a translator would have to go back to the original letters rather than retranslating the material and that would be expensive. So no, there has been some interest, but and the current Baron Freycinet, who vetted my account of his family, was very keen that it should be translated, but to my knowledge it's not going to happen.
Freycinet Peninsula in Tasmania, presumably is named after this man. When did he go there?
Well, Louis and Henri both went to Tasmania with Baudin, and they were both cartographers and surveyors, and so I'm not sure whether Louis named it after Henri or Henri named it after, but they definitely didn't name it after themselves.
So it wasn't on this voyage?
It wasn't on this voyage, no. They didn't go to Tasmania or the Victoria area on this voyage at all.
Back in Shark Bay, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that they converted the seawater to fresh water. Do you know how they did that?
With basically a copper pot with a hose pipe leading into another vessel they boiled the seawater so it evaporated and left the salt behind, and when it dripped down into the other, it was a still, basically.
So we'd just like to really thank you for coming today to our first meeting of 2023. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I would just like to comment that I don't think Rose really was neglected. It was her own family's descendants who had the journal published. A lot of men championed her. It was interesting that they changed a few things in the journal, but otherwise she wasn't a neglected figure really. But it's still interesting that the story has dropped out of sight and is now being brought back again. She was loved by a lot of men, and she was admired by all the crew and the officers. So she was supposed to be very beautiful. So I wouldn't like to create a wrong impression there.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, thanks everyone for coming along on a hot day, a very hot day in February.